So welcome everyone to the ESS seminar. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. David Olefeldt from the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta, Canada. Very excited about this talk. David is a peatland expert, and he's been working on peatlands throughout most of his career. So he earned a master's degree from Lund University in Sweden on peatland greenhouse gas exchange. And then he moved to Canada, but continued working in Sweden at the famous long-term research site Abisko to work on permafrost and carbon cycling. So he did a PhD at McGill in Montreal. And then after that, he moved to Gulf and was a postdoc working on wildfire and peatland carbon cycling, and is really involved with the permafrost carbon network. So I'm really looking forward to his talk on the future of northern peatlands, waking up a sleeping giant and setting it on fire.
Thank you, Claudia, and thanks for inviting me. It's been a fun opportunity to put together a presentation here with lots of research that my group's been involved in the last 6 years or so since I started my position here in Edmonton. And the titular sleeping giant are these northern peatlands that are currently held in permafrost. And they're a giant because of the large amounts of soil carbon, but also nutrients and contaminants like mercury and so that's stored in them. And much of the research in northern Canada that I've been leading over the last few years have been really in trying to understand how permafrost thaw and wildfire may affect the biogeochemistry of these large peatland areas. I want to start by acknowledging the graduate students here who are listed, who have done most of the work really and have been lead authors on their presentations. So I'm very much indebted to them. Not listed, but equally important often are the senior collaborators that I've worked with, but also the undergraduate field research assistants that we've had. It's been a pleasure working with all of them. I also want to acknowledge that much of this research is done in Canada, what's known as Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 territories, which is the home of the Dene, Gwich'in, Klitscho, Satu, Cree, as well as the Métis. And we recognize the land as an act of reconciliation, and we're very grateful to those whose territory we're visiting during our research trips. So for the presentation here to set the scene. So most of the research I'll be talking about today is done in this circled area of Canada. It is on the left-hand side here. It's one of the regions in the north that has the most expansive peatlands. So peatlands are wetlands that have accumulated an organic soil. And here you had a very early start. This is the opening of the glaciers 10,000 years ago, where people were able to migrate south, right? That was the colonization of North America through this Mackenzie River corridor, and the initiation of these peatlands occurred there. So it's quite common to have 4 meters of peat here, as this where we're taking a peat sample, but we've had some sites where it's up to even 6 or 7 meters of peat. So it's one of the carbon densest ecosystems on Earth, really, and it's all soil carbon. On top of that, it is a region of Canada and the world that is warming the fastest over the last couple of decades, so about 3 times faster than the global average, or a bit more than that. Being in the boreal Canadian zone, it's an area that has a very active fire regime, but we have also noted over the last 20, 30 years that we've had a number of really extreme fire years, mega fires that have burned the landscape. So there is likely an acceleration of the area burned per year. And then it's also an area that straddles this more southern permafrost zone. So it's more sensitive. The permafrost not very deep, it's discontinuous. And under these peatlands, often it's frozen a couple of meters down. So it's a fragmented landscape in that way. Another thing to keep in mind here is that most of these peatlands, most of their history was non-permafrost. So they developed for thousands of years without permafrost, and then after the Holocene cooling some 4,000 years ago, we started seeing this southward shift of the permafrost boundary. And really much of the peatlands that are frozen today only froze up about 1,200 years ago or so, around the Little Ice Age. But of course, the trend is in the other way direction now, and things are thawing at a very rapid pace. Here is what these peatland landscapes look like. I've taken it's a high-resolution satellite image. And one thing that should strike you is that it's this landscape of very discrete landscape units. It's very abrupt change from one type of landscape to the other. It's all peatland, but we have, for example, our peat plateaus, what we call the forested, or at least woodland areas with black spruce. They are the green-white areas that are dotted here. They're the only landscape unit in this peatland that has permafrost, so they're frozen. They're also being the only unit that is wooded, they're the only thing that carries fire. And on the sort of northwest corner here of this landscape, there's a blackened area where you can see how the plateaus burned at some point, quite recently probably. But you can also notice from this here is that when the fire moves through, you don't get the black surface on these other landscape types that are more moss-based. So it maybe just singes and then moves through. And those interspersed areas within these peat plateaus is what we call Thermocourse bogs. They're non-permafrost. They're dominated by sphagnum mosses. They look a bit more like their southern cousins south of the permafrost boundary. They can be divided further into what we call young and mature thermokarst. So the young is something that is thawed in the last 2-3 decades or so, often along the edges of plateaus where we have that active expansion of the thermokarst bogs. The plateaus are jacked up with the permafrost, so they're about 1 meter or 2 taller than the rest of the landscape due to the ice. And when the ice thaws in them, it collapses down, and these young bogs are much wetter. Sometimes they're even called moats. And they have a different species composition, right? And the mosses here, you can see they're bright green, and you can see those edges of green dotted in this landscape. Right? So they're about 10 to 15% of the landscape. Both the plateaus and these thermokarst bogs, they do generate a bit of runoff. And as that moves downstream, it becomes concentrated into these more nutrient-rich channel fens. So there you can see the dendritic system of channel fens that we have here. Those are often very nutrient-rich, have tall emergent vegetation, quite interesting. And then the last component of this landscape that I'll touch upon today are the open water, the ponds. They're often very shallow systems with peat sediments, thick peat sediments. But because where we are in the interior plains of Western Canada, our groundwater connections are such that they're often very nutrient rich. The lake on the top left here, the green, is an algal bloom. So these lakes are naturally mesotrophic to eutrophic or even hypereutrophic. So it's within this context or this landscape with these main characters that we've been studying: the greenhouse gas exchange, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. We've been doing some radiocarbon to understand for carbon dioxide and methane what layers and what ages are contributing to the fluxes. We've been trying to explain the patterns we see by looking at microbial communities and enzyme activities. We've also looked at total carbon storage, really taking a stock of what we have and comparing in space for time comparisons. And then we've been looking at the connections between the terrestrial and the aquatic, the movement of dissolved organic matter, but also contaminants as mercury, and how that affects downstream ecosystems. And lastly, today I'll be working on looking at some of the upscaling, where we take our knowledge and try to extrapolate it to larger areas to understand how it all fits together. So I'll be going through a number of studies here that have different aspects of this, and then wrap it up with the upscaling exercise that we have. So first off, we have a study of how wildfire affects the thermal regime of the plateau. Really, Carolyn Gibson here, she was wondering, how much does wildfire accelerate or cause permafrost thaw? And quite a lot, actually. These peat plateaus, they recover very slowly after fire. You can see the tree height and the tree recovery is quite slow. So our changes to our energy balance lasts a long time. And there's really two parts of this story, right? One is what happens on top of the plateau, and one is what happens on the edges. And Carolyn did 10,000 measurements of thaw depth. So this is the end of season. How far down do you have to push to reach the permafrost? And we compared these sites on which we have pictures of. And the unburned ones had an active layer of about 50 centimeters. And then quite quickly, in a few years after the fire, it went up to 85. And then it took some 20 years or so before it recovered. The other part here is what we call talics. These are zones further down that remain unfrozen in winter. So it's an unfrozen chunk of peat below where our freezing comes down. And they take, here it's expressed as percent of the landscape, so spatially, how common are they? And they take a while to open up. It takes sort of 10, 15 years before they expand in the landscape and really cover the whole peatland. And then they start freezing up again, and that takes another 15 years or so. So really a long-term effect on soil temperatures and how much of the peat profile that is thawed. Along the edges, of course, during that time, we're now changing the energy balance on the edges of these peat plateaus as well, and they start narrowing much quicker. The two pictures here shows these moats that are permafrost thaw happening in these areas that just recently burned. On the picture of the right, it's a bit further back in time. You can see that this site probably recovered enough so trees started growing again, but then you completely thawed and the landscape collapsed and the tree died again, right? So that's what we're seeing in the landscape. Using a remote sensing technique, we identified these bright green areas that are a recent thaw, and we could compare the abundance of those in burned and unburned areas. We did that at 4 sites, and in all 4 sites, we had a greater abundance of these young Thermocourse bogs in the burned than in the unburned. And this was some 20 to 30 years after the fire. The variability from one site to the other is how cold that site is. So what we call the 60th parallel is a warmer site than the Sama one, really showing that these southern warmer sites are naturally also expanding their young Thermocourse bogs very rapidly. But our estimate is that about, up to a quarter of all these young Thermocourse bog expansion has happened due to wildfire and would not have happened otherwise in this region. So now we'll go to the implications of this for greenhouse gases. And Carolyn did a study of chamber fluxes of carbon dioxide. And by having several depths of soil temperature and lots of measurements of fluxes, we were able to partition this carbon dioxide flux to shallow and deeper layers. And what we find is that the burned site actually has a lower respiration from shallow soil layers, which we think is due to the fire actually combusted off the more labile soil carbon at the top, leaving more recalcitrant peat left. But deeper down, the story is reversed, and we have a much greater, several times greater contribution of respiration from deeper layers. These are the recently thawed layers due to the fire. Christian Estop Aragonés also looked at this, but he used the radiocarbon, and we had Claudia was involved in this study and helped us set it up and run the analysis. And he also found that these intact plateaus had higher overall respiration of carbon dioxide, but a lower proportion of it came from what we call here the aged peat, which in this case was set to an average age of about 1,200 years before present. So the burnt plateau had generally higher contribution than aged. This I found, it's quite an interesting story. If you think about now old carbon that's being lost because it's deeper thaw and warmer, if you extrapolate that to 30 years, that actually becomes almost the same amount or equal amount of carbon that is lost through combustion during the wildfire itself. So it can be an important component of understanding the impact of wildfire on carbon cycling. And I thought it was so interesting that I actually set up last year, well, Chris did, one of these eddy covariance towers that we're now going to monitor a site that burned in 2019 for a number of years to see if we can get direct measurements of higher respiration for some parts of the year. Christian, though, also did the radiocarbon and at these young bog sites, so the bottom left here. So this is the non-permafrost but inundated wet. And in those, Christian found no evidence of a contribution of an aged component. We'll come back to the young bogs and the mature bogs in a few slides. I want to, in between here, we're also going to take a look at the third gas. Usually nitrous oxide is considered last. It's especially in the natural ecosystems, important from agricultural systems, less often studied in natural ecosystems such as peatlands. But we'd seen a couple of studies from Europe, Northern Europe, where permafrost peatlands that became non-vegetated during their degradation had high nitrous oxide emissions. And that resembled the burnt areas that we have in Western Canada. So Christopher Schulze has set out to assess the nitrous oxide emissions from the burnt, the unburned plateau, and also the Thermocourse bogs. And we did not find release of nitrous oxide due to fire. The release of nutrients conditions are not right. These are very low fluxes. These are quite close to our detection limit, but where we actually had measurable fluxes, it was not emissions of nitrous oxide, it was uptake of nitrous oxide, and we found it during the warmer periods of the year from the Thermocourse bogs. So the Thermocourse bogs, we are interpreting this as they're so nutrient or nitrogen deprived, so low availability of nitrogen that the denitrifiers actually have to pull nitrous oxide out of the atmosphere for their denitrification process. And this is supported by concentrations in the peat profile. In these young bog and mature bog, once we hit the water table, our dissolved concentrations of nitrous oxide go well below the atmospheric equilibrium. Not shown here, but this is opposite, of course, what we have with methane, where all of a sudden below the water table, we have very high methane concentrations. Okay, so we're now back looking at these Thermocourse bogs, and we will look at carbon dioxide again. And this is Liam Heffernan's work, and he spent 3 years fluxing, chamber fluxing, both the young and the mature. And the question here was really this young stage, how different is it, right? Do we have a rapid pulse of high biogeochemistry, high turnover that could be a carbon source? He used both opaque chambers and clear chambers so we could separate ecosystem respiration and gross primary production. And all of these years, all 3 years, what Liam found was that the mature bog, the one in the background here behind them, had both higher productivity and ecosystem respiration. Much of the difference thus is probably due to differences in autotrophic respiration rather than our heterotrophic respiration. We can look at the overall, the net carbon balance. So we've modeled our NEE throughout the year and 3 years of data. And what Liam found was we had very high variability. So the first year in 2016, both the young and the mature bog were actually sources of CO2. So wintertime releasing CO2, summer we start taking up, and then we have fall and winter again with release, right? We end up with a positive value, which is a net source. The next year, our summer, we had much greater uptake during the summer, and we ended up as being a net sink. And in the third year, they diverged, and our young bog was a source while our mature bog was a sink. And this is a quite large variability. So unfortunately, this doesn't really allow us to say much about the long-term carbon status of this site, right? We see that it has a high variability. And we also learn quite a bit about what drives the variability. And it seems to be different. So the young bog, the driver of the interannual variability is inundation. And in the wet years, such as the bottom here, we suppress primary production, and the site is a net source of carbon dioxide. And then in the slightly drier year, as in 2017, the site is more productive, and that outweighs and become a carbon dioxide sink. For the mature bog in the background, inundation doesn't happen, even in really wet years, and the main driver instead is soil temperature. And the first year was a very warm year. So here, it's really the effect of warming on soil respiration that seems to be driving the source. And in the slightly cooler years, we ended up being a sink of carbon dioxide because less heterotrophic respiration. Liam also wanted to explain these differences and really think about the potential vulnerability of carbon, deep carbon, old carbon. And he looked at both enzyme activity and the microbial communities with depth in these two sites. So in the young bog and in the mature bog outside of here. So the potential enzyme activity, so the potential to break down organic matter is, of course, or not surprisingly, higher near the surface than at depth in both the young and mature. He found no difference in enzyme activity at depth between the young and the mature, and very low overall. So it's recalcitrant peat at depth. Our microbial communities, though, they do show some differences. In this figure, it's an ordination diagram of our microbial community. So the closer you are, the more similar your community is. The star indicates the surface samples, and then you go down core. And we had the greatest differences between the young and the mature bog at the surface. And then there's a convergence as we go down core. But even at depth, they do not completely overlap. And the microbial community that we have at about 20 centimeters in the young is really what we have all the way down to 1.5 meters in the young one, right? So some differences in microbial community. And as he went in deeper into this, we find that one of the main differences has to do with our methanogen community. And the young bog has a greater abundance of our acidoclastic methanogens versus our completely hydrogenotrophic community in the mature bog. Acidoclastic methanogenesis is energetically more favorable, so it can yield more methane production. And this also aligns with the surface fluxes that Liam did at these. And consistently throughout these 3 years, we have at least twice as high methane emissions out of these young bogs than the mature bogs. Part of that is likely due to environmental conditions. They are a bit wetter overall, but we do think that these changes or differences in microbial communities could be one aspect of this as well. At the same time, the cumulative losses of methane from the young bog is still not large enough to turn the site into a very large methane or carbon dioxide carbons have a loss of total carbon storage. And one other way of looking at the net effect of the carbon balance is not to measure it directly by fluxes, but to use stored carbon, look at the stocks of carbon. So we've at two sites, our Lutos and our Scotty Creek sites, we've taken up a number of full cores and we've accounted for the total amount of carbon per square meter. And we've done this in transects. We've taken cores on the plateau, at the edge, and then intermediate, and then out in the mature. And we've carbon dated in the peat profile the transition from the type of peat from the plateau to the bog, so we know how long ago they thawed. So then we can plot total carbon storage versus time since thaw. And the Luto site here, it's trending towards lower, but it's not significant. So a fairly neutral site following thaw. At our Scotty Creek site, however, it's hard not to look at this and think that we have a loss of carbon post-thaw. Now, this is not the site where much of our fluxes are from, so I'm quite curious if we had surface fluxes, if they would help us, substantiate this trend. One of the differences between these sites is the length of permafrost conditions. The Luto site froze up only about 1,200 years ago, so it has a very long history of being in non-permafrost conditions, which may be why we don't have much of a response or aged radiocarbon, CO2, methane leaving the site. On the other hand, our Scotty Creek site was probably a permafrost site for about 4,000 years until this recent thaw. And it's possible that that longer history and the type of peat that has accumulated is more labile. Next, we're going to look at the links between the terrestrial and the aquatic and the movement of dissolved organic carbon from these peatlands downstream. Now, in the region we are, it's a subhumid climate, so our runoff generation is quite low. We have only about between 50 and 100 millimeters of runoff per year. So no matter how high our concentrations are of carbon in the water, it's still not going to be a major component of the carbon balance of these peatlands. Our estimate is that it's less than 3 grams of carbon per year that leaves these peatlands on average. But it might be very important in how it shapes downstream carbon balances and aquatic ecosystems. So we monitored 2 streams that are almost fully peatland. You can see the color of these streams. So lots of organic carbon leaving these systems. We sampled them for radiocarbon 3 times over a year. These are 2 streams. And for both of them, we found that the stream DOC was modern or even above fraction modern 1 for the whole time. We compared it to the radiocarbon age of DOC in pore water of the bog and the peat plateau that we did at this time of the year. So it's quite interesting. We do have quite a lot of aged old DOC in these peat plateaus, but we don't see much of an influence on it at the outflow. We also looked at the radiocarbon age in the food webs of these streams, so both algae and then our invertebrates and fish. And again, the radiocarbon of these this biomass is close to modern, with only minor contributions of carbon derived from these deep old peat stores. So I find that quite interesting because similar type of studies that have looked in really carbon poor Arctic systems find that their food webs can be substantially subsidized by very old carbon. But here in the landscape where we have very large stores of old carbon, we see that our aquatic food web is primarily driven by modern turnover. One thing to note, we had one burned and one unburned catchment, and it really seemed like the burned catchment was even more, so to say, modern in its signal. One interpretation of that we have is that when these peatlands burn, we do see that they release quite significant amount of phosphorus, and this phosphorus basically fuels primary productivity in the downstream streams and lakes, right? And that then feeds into the food web. Movement of dissolved organic carbon is one side of it, but we also often have, we can have mercury that accompanies this dissolved organic matter. So mercury accumulates in peatlands by atmospheric deposition. And if the conditions are right, which means that if it's anoxic and we have some groundwater contribution, that inorganic mercury can be microbially transformed into methyl mercury, which really is the more toxic species of mercury and the one that bioaccumulates. So peat plateaus being quite dry, they tend to accumulate mercury and not methylate it. But once we have the collapse and those sites turn into either Thermocourse bogs or fens, now that mercury is at risk of methylation and potentially downstream transport. So Lauren Thompson has started a study of looking at the concentrations in pore water, and she found a very striking pattern of the highest methyl mercury in the rich fen, and then the poor fen, and the lowest in the bog, indicating that it really, how much of a groundwater connection is important for realizing the potential of methylation. Lauren has also looked at this from the opposite range of the scale, and we've sampled streams and lakes across a 1,000-mile transect from continuous permafrost down to non-permafrost. And at that scale, what we find is that we don't see higher methyl mercury concentrations in this region of rapid thaw, the discontinuous area here in the center. Instead, what drives the variability at large really is how much peatlands we have in the stream catchments or the lake catchments. And permafrost conditions is not even found as a secondary driver of that, right? So more peatlands, more dissolved organic carbon, more methyl mercury. We do find that there's a difference between the streams and lakes. In some settings, in other settings, it's actually often lakes and ponds that are sources of methyl mercury. But in our landscape, all of our lakes have lower concentrations than our streams, indicating that methyl mercury is sourced in the Thermocourse bogs and fens, moves into lakes where it's demethylated, so turned back into inorganic, less harmful mercury. We've looked at these lakes also from the greenhouse gas perspective. So Mackenzie Kuhn has looked at this both from the carbon dioxide and methane. So she studied 20 lakes, 5 in each of these 4 locations across this large permafrost gradient. And we found quite strong response here of permafrost conditions, both for carbon dioxide and for methane. We were a bit surprised by the carbon dioxide. We were anticipating, given the amount of organic matter that we have there, that the warmer conditions further south would lead to more carbon dioxide being released. But we found the opposite. Actually, as we go south, we flip from having our lakes being CO2 sources to being neutral or even CO2 sinks. And we attribute this to the connectivity to the landscape. So as we're opening up new flow paths, we're now able to bring in more nutrients and more ions, and we have a more productive lake for that reason. For methane, we find that as we go both southern to warmer locations, we end up with higher emissions. And this is a very rapid increase. It's several times greater. if you translate this to a Q10 from mean annual temperature, it ends up being much higher than you expect from similar methane Q10s from individual studies. And that seems to indicate to us that it's more than a temperature response, even if that's, you know, key to this as well. But it also might be linked to the CO2 in that more productive lakes create more labile material that's available for microbial anaerobic methane production. Sorry. So last part is that study didn't immediately explicitly deal with Thermocourse lake expansion. So many of these lakes are just like the Thermocourse bogs, expanding and depositing potentially labile organic matter into anaerobic conditions, driving methane emissions. So a few of the lakes, and particularly this one here, Kenzie did a very detailed study of the spatial variability of methane emissions, both the diffusive and the bubble emissions together. We have on this little pond a thaw edge. This is where we have active collapse of the peat plateau into the pond. And on the other side, we have what's a stable edge, where we see no evidence either in the vegetation, and we also have evidence from our sediment cores showing that it's been a pond for a long time. And Kenzie found that this thaw edge side had significantly higher emissions, both diffusive and bubble emissions, than the stable edge, and also higher than centrally in this lake. Here, Kenzie also had, we managed to get radiocarbon dates of the methane coming out of this pond, finding that both the stable edge and the center had modern methane being released, so driven by probably the near surface sediment biogeochemistry. But the thaw edge, we found, had an average age of about 1200 year BP, indicating that much of this methane production actually comes from deeper down the profile in this recently thawed out peat material. So for this region where we've been working the last 6 years, one of the next challenges that I have is that we've been looking at all these different components, right? And we know how lakes are responding, we know how the plateaus are responding and the bogs are responding, and we also have ideas of their transitions, right? How often they burn and how fast they're expanding. So in the next few years, we have projects where we actually want to try to put that together and try to understand what has been the driving process affecting the overall greenhouse gas and net radiative forcing of this landscape. And I think these are my bets for the main. I haven't spoken about this, but of course, combustion of carbon dioxide due to direct wildfire, or is it the methane in the expanding bogs, or the warming that affects methane both in bogs and ponds, or that deepening of the active layer and release of carbon dioxide, or is it has to do with the nitrous oxide? So you're a year or two early, and I'll get back to you with the net result from this. One upscaling study that we have some results from, though, we're going to now go to the even larger scale. It's the last study here I have. And we are here only focusing on methane solely. So from my presentation here, it should be obvious that methane emissions from northern ponds and lakes and wetlands is sensitive to climate change. But in order to understand how important that is at the global scale, you sort of need to know, well, what are our current day emissions of methane? And we do know that northern emissions are smaller than, of course, the tropical methane emissions, but there's a large range in our current day estimates, from 21 to 77 teragrams of methane per year. Out of the total, what, 250 is global lake and wetland emissions, I think. But our starting point matters if we want to know the sensitivity into the future. And on top of that, these estimates of methane emissions, there is an inconsistency or discrepancy between methodology for how it's being estimated. So bottom-up estimates is where you start with a land cover database or land cover map, and then you attach fluxes or use a process-based model and work yourself up to an estimate of emissions. And they are usually ending up with higher emissions estimates than when you're using top-down. And top-down is atmospheric inversion modeling based on atmospheric concentrations, spatial and temporal variability in our methane concentration and isotopic fractions. Now, both of those approaches have weaknesses, and I don't know which one always is right or wrong, but I'm better able to talk to the bottom up because I'm not an atmospheric scientist. But it seemed to me that many of these bottom-up estimates has been suffering from a scaling issue in that they very rarely, or if at all, have more than one lake class and one wetland class, right? They say, like, these are wetlands and these are lakes, and then they use data from all these sites jointly together to extrapolate, right? And having done a synthesis here and done by Mackenzie Coonigan, we have scoured the synthesis, some 200 studies at least, and I think we're up to more than 2,000 sites here where we have small scale measurements of methane emissions. And we wanted to classify into as few classes as possible that had as distinct differences in methane emissions as possible as well, right? So we ended up with 5 wetland classes, 2 with permafrost bog and wet tundra, and then 3 non-permafrost wetlands, so marshes, fens, and bogs. And these are the emissions from literature survey. And then we did the same for ponds and lakes. And we've split it into 3 size classes. But also, and importantly, we've now differed between lakes that have thick organic sediments, either peaty or Jedoma sediments from northeastern Russia and Alaska. And therefore we can split these classes out as having distinct methane emissions. So ideally then we want to have a map that has these classes, and that doesn't exist. And remote sensing is advancing fast, but they're not there yet. So I took a shortcut in that I asked 30 experts that work in the Arctic, and I gave them 20 of these cells each, and I asked them with lots of additional information, what do you estimate that the fractional extent of these wetland and lake classes are within each one of these cells? And I also had about 100 data layers from available spatial data. So this is data that I considered to be having some information that could help us differentiate between these land cover types that I'm interested in. So with an expert assessment and the available spatial data, I ran a random forest model, and you end up with a distribution of each one of these land cover classes with uncertainty estimates based on the experts, how much convergence we have between experts. So yeah, this is what total lake and total wetland, but again, we call this the Boreal Arctic Wetland and Lake Dataset, and we're just about to submit this in the next few days, really. So the cool thing about it is that we have now estimates of these different wetland classes separately in their areal extent, and they match the database of field measured methane emissions. So Kenzie is working on the upscaling of it. Yes. And one of the things that become very obvious when we do this, and this is what I expected, and it is that you do need to consider both hotspots and cold spots in your upscaling. So marshes being hotspots, they have very high emissions per unit area, but they're quite limited in their areal extent. But they end up with almost the same amount of methane emissions as bogs, which we have an order of magnitude greater areal extent of. And this is a distinction that previous land cover models were not making. So here we present the total, but again, these totals for lake and wetland emissions are the sum of each of their land cover classes. We end up with 23 teragrams of methane per year from wetlands and 7.5 from our lake emissions. And that puts us in the lower range of these bottom-up scales. So I think this refined way of doing it might alleviate some of the bias in the previous upscaling bottom-ups that have yielded almost too high emissions. I think this is a refinement and an improvement of bottom-up emissions. Next steps with this is to start playing with scenarios. We can increase temperatures, we can change transition permafrost to non-permafrost and expand lakes and see what could be more important going into the future. And Kenzie is also working on using this database with process-based modeling and the inverse modeling community. So I'm excited to see how this progresses. And with that, I'll round off and thank you all for listening. And again, thanks to the graduate students who've made this happen.
I thank David for this great talk. Really fantastic overview and lots of new data. So I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. There's one in the chat from, you want to unmute yourself? Sasha?
Right, I found the chat too.
Can you see the question?
Yes.
Okay, going back to the graph of carbon stocks plotted against time since thaw, what do you think drives the carbon loss? Is it the collapse of black spruce and lack of below ground carbon input, or is it decomposition? And what percentage of NEP can be attributed to lateral carbon export as runoff?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first off, the first part of the question there, what could drive carbon loss at depth in these peatlands, right? And it's a tough one, right? Because it is anaerobic and it's fairly old peat, so it shouldn't be labile. At the same time, I don't know if you guys are aware of the Spruce project in Minnesota, where they've been heating peat at depth experimentally. And after a few years there, they did find that you started seeing old carbon being released at the surface, right? So, and that's under anaerobic conditions. So a warming seems to have the potential to cause decomposition at depth. I don't think it could leave any other way. It's not moving laterally away. Some of it could be methane. The methane emissions are pretty high. But I also think that you should have some, you should be humble to the accuracy of the approach and some of the assumptions of that time for space analysis and the precision of it. It's not an easy way to look at carbon stocks and know that the difference is due to what happened after thaw, rather than something that happened earlier in their developmental history.
That's another question from John. You want to ask directly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk, David. That was really cool. I just wanted to get a sense to learn a little bit more about those maps of wetland and lake cover that you've shown in the end. Do you have a sense of what sort of how you might describe the accuracy or the validation for it? I know that it's maybe kind of challenging with something so global, but be curious to know. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that I've done, I don't know if there's a way of checking accuracy really, but what I have done is I have looked at wetland mapping that's been done on regional basis, where they've been doing it to these different wetland classes. So we have the Canadian Wetland Inventory that covers parts of Boreal Canada, and there's a fairly good wetland mapping in the West Siberian lowlands, for example. So those are independent data sets of what we have, and I've done comparisons against those, and it looks reasonable, right? That's the type of accuracy assessment we can do. I think that it's important to keep in track or keep in mind that this database will be, I mean, it is an expert assessment. It's not based on observational data directly, right? It's informed by it, but not a new remote sensing product.
Cool. I'm sorry, could I follow up with one more really easy question? Is that data set static? Like, is there just one point in time that it represents?
Yeah.
I assume it must be really hard to come up with an expert assessment that changes over time.
Yeah. So it is one that is a single point in time. However, here's the thing about wetland mapping. Often you see these wetland mapping, right, where wetlands seem to contract and expand, right?
Yeah.
In my mind, a wetland that dries out is still a wetland. It doesn't have to be inundated to be a wetland. Wetlands are actually static in the landscape. What they are, they flip in their inundation state.
Mm.
So I think you could apply to this, though, that there are certain wetland types in here, like the marshes and the wet tundra, that are likely to have dry and wet phases. They're probably the ones that would be flipping from dry and wet states. Bogs and fens, as you can see in this picture, you rarely have open water in them anyways.
Yeah. How about when permafrost thaws and the forests fall over and these bogs expand? Is there any sense of how fast that is happening?
Yeah, we have pretty good idea from the landscape that I worked in, where we have had, let me see here. I think it's, 20–30% of plateaus have collapsed in the last 30 years or so. And it's accelerating too. So this discontinuous area, these treed peat plateaus are going to be gone in a few decades.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you.
Talking about the changing Arctic. Okay, are there more questions from the audience? I had a question about the connectivity between the lakes that you mentioned. So you were talking about, I guess, lateral connectivity through existing or absent permafrost. Do you also consider kind of their position within potential lowland areas, and the lakes can be like a remnant of a drying up basin and so on? How important is that in addition to just the absence of permafrost?
Yeah, I didn't go into that in detail here, but what we do find is that we have a great divergence in variability as we go from north to south. So all the lakes have about the same water chemistry in the permafrost region because it's all surface and near close by hydrology, right? And then as we go south and we have these potential connectivities open up, but some of the lakes are in higher elevations, so they will not get groundwater connectivity even when permafrost has gone away, right? So our variability in water chemistry increases dramatically. It's not just the average that shifts, it's the variability as well. We even have 1 or 2 lakes in the no permafrost zone where we have a really saline groundwater coming up with lots of sulfur that it actually shuts down methane production completely.
What's the topographic differences and like how variable is the landscape?
You don't
permafrost area.
Yeah, you don't have to have much of a difference in land, like elevational position, right? It can be 20–30 meters, and that's the difference whether you have that deep groundwater connectivity or not. Because it's very, these are flat landscapes in general.
Right. Great, thank you. Let's thank David one more time if there are no other questions. I can't see everyone on the screen, so okay, I think that's
Thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming, and thank you, David.